The Night of the Gunfrighters. Chapter 1.
Sam Barnett's dead. They shot him. They shot him right there in front of everybody.
It was Howie Pruitt, a stock clerk. He had run a block and a half in the noonday sun and was now winded and scared. Breathing hard, he rested his wiry frame against the countertop and brushed his brown, sweat-drenched hair out of his eyes. He was just a kid, barely 18.
"What are we going to do?" he cried. "Sam Barnett was our best hope, and now he's
dead. Sam Barnett was the toughest man we'd ever seen. As tough as Texas marble, he liked to say. He had a big reputation as a fast draw, and some said a rattlesnake mean killer. We hadn't asked a lot of questions about his past or the men he'd killed. Real lawmen weren't always as virtuous as the dime novels would have you believe. We just figured that, with him, our town finally had a chance to break out of the yoke it'd been placed in. But one of the McCullough boys, it turned out, probably perched up on the general store roof with a buffalo gun, had cut the man right down with a single shot to the back of the skull. Sam was dead before he realized that the noise he'd heard was a rifle shot, before he realized that he was a dead man, which, I suppose, is some kind of merciful. He'd been out of town marshal for a week.
"We ought to get together, all of us," Howie said. "We ought to get some guns and run those damn McCulloughs." Psst.
I shushed him. You just never knew who was listening or who you could trust. Somehow the McCulloughs were always a step ahead of us. Once we even brought in the army for a look, but it ended in disaster. Leading 20 men armed with revolvers and carbines, Captain Winslow Bierce, a veteran of some of the heaviest fighting of the Civil War, rode out to the McCullough spread swearing he'd get to the bottom of things. And then, I don't know. He came back a different man. His men were laughing at us. Captain Bierce claimed that he hadn't seen one blessed thing out of the ordinary, even though we told him exactly where that box canyon was where the McCulloughs had run in stolen cattle from the next county. The McCulloughs couldn't have hidden all that cattle that quickly. But the soldiers rode back to their fort, laughing. Sam Barnett's death was a new low on the scale of miserable with which we measured our lives. The first two marshals we tried to hire that year had been stampeded off once they figured out how big the challenge was and how difficult it was to find deputies. The third, an experienced lawman of skill and courage, was murdered in his sleep. But this... the McCulloughs just wanted to show us they could do anything they wanted, and there wasn't a thing we could do about it. We weren't cowards. At least, not always. We'd handled bad men and hostile Indians, good times and hard without the need for calling in anybody. But all that changed when the McCulloughs come to town. They were uncommon ornery, and uncommon lucky. They were into everything. Cattle rustling, land grabbing, armed robbery, and murder. But no one could prove it. Rumor had it they'd gotten to the district judge and they owned him. They had us hamstrung, and that was a fact. My hardware store never made a profit. It all went to the McCullough spread. "Just put it on my tab," Bully Bill McCullough would taunt. But every time I pulled their records out at the end of the month to make a reckoning, I'd find that the account had been zeroed out. There it was in my own handwriting. The bills were paid. If that were so, I'd wondered where the money went, because it sure never got inside of my safe. Every month, it was the same thing. "Put it on my tab." And then the tab would zero itself out. It was damn creepy. Some people might have suspected my stock clerk of conniving with the McCulloughs and that he was sneaking into my office and changing the accounts. But Rich Fayette, who owned the general store, was in the same pickle. Zeke Miller of the livery stable, and particularly Dan Hayes, who owned the saloon, were all near busted, just like me. Howie couldn't have been sneaking into all those places. Besides, I trusted him. After the funeral, such as it was, we stood around Sam's grave and wondered out loud what we were going to do. That's when old Joe Moss, the town dentist and undertaker, coughing up blood from the consumption, limped over. His thick, salt and pepper beard obscured most of his face, but you could tell from the way his bushy eyebrows furrowed together that he was agitated, for behind his spectacles, his faded blue eyes darted quickly over his surroundings, the way they always did when we had to talk about the McCulloughs. We were always watching the shadows. Joe pulled a small card from his pocket.
I found this at my nightstand this morning,
he rasped between coughs.
I don't know how it got there. I don't...
Then the coughing overtook him again. He tried to wipe the blood away from his mouth with his handkerchief before we could see it. But we knew. He was dying. Just like our town. I took the card and held it up to the light. The writing was real pretty. It was like something you might see on a wedding invite. I read it aloud. Are criminals, murderers, and thieves a problem? Can't keep a sheriff alive for more than a couple of days? Wire G. W. Blake, the Gunfrighter, Salem, Massachusetts. Satisfaction guaranteed. References available. Gunfrighter. Dan Hayes scoffed in his deep, rich baritone. The fellow can't even spell. Dan was a big man, former prize fighter who went by the name of Dandy Dan Hayes, but underneath all the swagger, behind the velvet voice and the huge black handlebar mustache, he was just as nervous talking about the McCulloughs as any of us. You don't need to know how to spell to kill somebody, I said. We've already tried it your way, and what do we got for it? Asked Rich Fayette in a perpetually whining voice that still managed to be a southern drawl. Rich was a well-fed but not quite portly man of medium height who wore loose-fitting white seersucker suits and a big straw plantation hat over his thinning blonde hair. In the center of his broad face perched an angular, hawk-like nose that stuck out like it was trying to take flight. You could always tell when he was coming, as the stench from his roots would precede him by about 10 minutes. The McCulloughs run this place now. There's nothing we can do about that. Maybe we should just give them what they want and go about our business. He didn't mean it. I knew that. I tended to give Rich plenty of slack as a rule because he had worries beyond the store failing. Rich's wife was one of the few women still living in Schuster's Well. Another victim of the female sickness, we called it. She'd taken ill nearly a year ago. Usually, a woman would only last a couple of months after it got her. They'd come into town just as young and healthy as you can imagine and start aging. Fast. Their hair would go gray. Then wrinkles and liver spots would sprout up and then they'd die. That's what happened to my Cassie. That's what happened to old Joe's Florence. Rich Fayette's wife was putting up a scrap, though, and was still holding on to life. There were a few other women in town who weren't dead yet, including the 3 girls Dan Hayes had brought in from the east to work his bar. They're all sick, clinging to life, but dying in their beds. Rich had kept his wife cooped up in a house outside of town, thinking that he would protect her from the sickness, whatever it was. But in the end, I guess it did him no good. Heck, we'd never even seen her. Had no idea what she looked like. Then, of course, there was Granny Ma McCullough, living out there in the hills overlooking the town with the rest of her clan. She's supposed to be older than Moses, but we'd never seen her. Truth to tell, if she's anything like her kin, we didn't want to. Doc Randall, who was still a young man not out of medical school, took the card from me and examined it. "Maybe it's somebody's idea of a joke," he said. "Or some kind of trick," said Howie. "You said it just appeared on your nightstand, Mr. Moss? Someone had to put it there." Dan Hayes took the card and pondered it, and then passed it over to Rich. Now, there was something about that little card and its fancy writing. Somehow it made us feel a little calmer. Just our imagination, I reckon, but it did. It made a fella feel better just touching it. "I say we do it," Dan pronounced with a grand, sweeping gesture. "It couldn't hurt," old Joe muttered between coughs. Rich looked us over, realized we were taking an official vote, then jogged over to the livery stable to consult Zeke Miller. "It's up to you," the doctor said, a little nervously, wiping off the sweat that had beaded up on his well-oiled black hair. "I can't take sides, you know that. I swore an oath." "I say yes." That was Howie again, just like he had a right to pipe in. I could see Rich coming out of the livery stable across the street. He was talking to himself and threw his hands up like he was trying to quiet an angry mob. Then his hands dropped back to his sides and he shook his head in frustration. "Zeke says yes, and I say we ought to have our heads examined," he called out while making his way back across the road to join us. "But yes, count me in. I guess things can't get any worse." "My vote makes it unanimous," I said. With that, the Businessmen's Association of Schuster's Well agreed to wire G.W. Blake for help. "Whoever he is, I hope he has an army with him," spoke Howie. "I hope he runs those bastards right out of the state. Kill him, maybe." Shh! Again, I had to shush him. "What kind of gunfighter lives in Massachusetts?" Rich drawled, mostly to himself. Which we should have realized then was a damn good question. What in tarnation kind of mad dog killer lives in Massachusetts? End part 1. It's not a bad reading.